Okay, so in this lecture we're going to be talking about amphetamines. We're going to be talking, this is more of a descriptive lecture about what they actually are and what they do, and we're going to go through a range of the development of amphetamines as well. So amphetamine, first synthesized by this chap, a Romanian chemist. I'm not going to have a go at the pronunciation there. And then methamphetamine was synthesized in 1893 by this Japanese chemist. Here we can see the chemical structures. So you can see at the bottom that amphetamine and methamphetamine are similar structures. And you can also see the similarity between the endogenous amines, the dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. The amines which these drugs target. And then you can see ecstasy there, which is slightly more complicated chemical, but similar basic structure. So what does amphetamine do? It essentially causes a massive release of noradrenaline and dopamine. So it doesn't affect serotonin as ecstasy does. So it does this by entering the presynaptic neuron, entering the vesicles and causing a displacement of the noradrenaline and dopamine, so causing a massive outflow of these monoamines. What's the difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine? Essentially, methamphetamine is more potent, and it's longer, slightly longer lasting action in comparable doses. Essentially, they do the same thing. Okay. So not a great deal was done with it until this chap resynthesized it and noted its very marked sympathomimetic properties. And in these days, chemists would try it on themselves. And so he tried some amphetamine, and this is what he noted, was that his nose was dry and clear, his pulse and blood pressure climbed dramatically, and he had this intense feeling of well-being, and he grew very chatty and considered himself unusually witty. And that absolutely fits in with the effects of amphetamines. Lasts for quite a long time. So it lasted all evening for him. So, building on the effect it had of drying the nose, it was first used as a decongestant with the brand name of Benzedrine. So in tablet form, the amphetamine Benzedrine sulfate was introduced, and it was used for all of these indications. And This is an advert for Benzedrine. Only in the last decade has there been available in Benzedrine sulfate a therapeutic weapon capable of alleviating depression, overcoming chronic fatigue, and breaking the vicious circle of anhedonia. So, it would almost certainly do that for the evening. It's very much questionable whether it would do that the next day. Methamphetamine was sold and used a lot in the Second World War under the name of Pervitin. I'm not entirely sure how that's pronounced. We'll go with that. Now, many of the armies used amphetamines with the thought that it would be a benefit to their airmen and army. So Fliegerschokolade and Panzerschokolade, these were given to the pilots and the German tank crews. Certainly amphetamines were used by the Japanese and given to their pilots. So very, very widely used. There were lots of tales of the soldiers developing either really marked fatigue after not sleeping for 3 days, which is understandable, or becoming psychotic and certainly reports of them just them shooting their own soldiers. Not a very successful use. So amphetamines were quite widely used in. Have you heard of Purple Hearts? So Purple Hearts were used. They were a combination of amphetamines and a barbiturate, and this was probably the first big drug craze, or certainly the big modern post-war drug craze. It was very strongly associated with mod cultures. In the 60s and early 70s, you're either a mod or a rocker, and the mods used amphetamines, and they used Purple Hearts quite a lot. And as you can, they wanted to differentiate from the intoxication caused by alcohol and other drugs. I mean, probably heroin and glue were around at the time. Speed symbolised the smart, on-the-ball, cool image, the mod image. They sought stimulation, not intoxication, greater awareness, not escape, confidence and articulacy, rather than the drunken rowdiness of previous generations and probably what they thought the rockers did. Amphetamines were commonly known, certainly in the 70s and 80s, as speed. In the 80s, certainly, if you had money, you would use cocaine, but speed was and remains incredibly cheap. So you could buy a £10. So a gram would cost you £10, and 1 gram between the two of you, would be enough for all that night and the next day, probably, and incredibly cheap if you were buying it in bulk. So you could buy an ounce, which is 28 grams, for about £70. So incredibly cheap. So if you're snorting it, then just a few minutes to for the effects to start. Cocaine is an anaesthetic, so cocaine will anaesthetise the nose. Speed is rather toxic. It's quite painful snorting speed. So a lot of users will take it orally. Typically, the speed is wrapped up in a cigarette paper and swallowed. And this is colloquially the term for this is bombing speed. So if you're talking to a patient, you'd say, do you snort it or do you bomb it? And again, in contrast to cocaine, amphetamines are very long acting, so they will last 6 or 12 hours or even longer. So not uncommon if you're using speed on a Friday evening, not getting to sleep until the Sunday evening. And this is what it does. Pleasure, confidence, energy, repeated simple things like itching and scratching, or doodling and drawing for hours on end, teeth grinding, reduced appetite, increased sex drive. Okay, that's speed. That's the end of the bit about speed. Now, we talked about amphetamine, mostly methamphetamine, the slang term being speed, used with barbiturates in the 70s, and by itself in the 80s and 90s. But more recently, what we have, and what you may have heard, I'm sure you've watched that silly program, Breaking Bad. If you haven't watched it, don't bother. But that's all about crystal meth. So the next few slides are going to describe what crystal meth is. It's essentially methamphetamine, but in a smokable form. So same drug, just a different route of administration. So crystal meth is relatively easily synthesized. Can be quite dangerous, however, to synthesize. You hear lots of stories of people trying this and blowing themselves up. So this is what crystal meth looks like. So it's white crystals, essentially. Hence the name. Slang term for this is either simply meth, or ice, tina, or crank are the commonly used slang terms. So the most common method is using a red phosphorus, which you can get from the tips of red matches, ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, and an iodine. And this particular method is called the red, white, and blue process. There are other ways of making crystal meth. So that's what it looks like in a bag. So these small crystals of meth would be smoked in a glass pipe. So in a similar way to how crack cocaine is smoked in a pipe. This is a meth pipe. So a meth pipe in action, and a meth pipe with some meth beside it there. So how much does it cost? Interestingly, and I don't think there's a very clear answer to this, is why crystal meth is not prevalent in the UK. So it's really prevalent in the United States. The only patients that I've ever seen using crystal meth are, it's big in the gay scene. I've had patients from London and Manchester, but outside of the gay scene in big cities, I've not heard of it being used, and I don't know why. So I couldn't tell you how much crystal meth costs in the UK. So for a gram, it's $80 in the US, or $20 a hit, and these hits these last a long time. So in terms of value for money, this is good. This is good value for money. Again, this is from the user blog website of the effects of crystal meth. So somebody here using with their two friends. Meth is an incredible drug. I was effed up out of my mind, but I was completely in control of myself. So like the mods described, it was alerting but not intoxicating. My mind would jump all over the place at 100 miles per hour, so I found it difficult to hold a coherent thought for more than 10 or so seconds. Frustrating when talking, and just talking so much but losing track of what you're listening to and what you're talking about. I know that other experienced state that they were able to concentrate better, but not me. You've heard of amphetamines are essentially the basis for treating ADHD, and will lead to an increase in concentration. This is a dose effect. So if you take a small amount of amphetamine, regardless of whether you have ADHD, then it will lead to an increase in your ability to concentrate. But these are, these are abuse levels of dosing that they're taking.
So is it speed that was being used by students to help them to study?
Yeah. So again, same drug, amphetamine, but at a much lower drug than these guys are using now. As you will see from how they go on to describe their experience. So basically talking solidly for 8 hours and not really listening, or being able to listen, kept talking and talking at remarkable speed. And then I kept speeding all through the night and all the next day, and so did the other two. I don't know if you remember me talking about heroin being very good for cleaning and housework, but amphetamines, you need to be doing something. So he just did lots of housework and kept cleaning, and started to become paranoid, in inverted commas, some overvalued ideas of persecution, and couldn't settle. So this was then the next day, still unsettled, at which point they smoked 2 more bulbs in a row and started to speed hardcore again. I can't remember what happened from then until about 1 a.m. on the next day. So they're going for 2 days. So not uncommon for speed users to go on a run. So if I'm talking to a patient, I'll typically ask, what's the longest run you've had, and people will not uncommonly talk about being up for 5 days on a stretch. So certainly a very long-acting drug. And I think that's the end. Any questions and comments, please post them in the comments section below.